Everyone knows Samsung. It is the phone in a billion pockets, the screen on a billion walls, the chip inside devices that do not even carry its name. It is the single largest company in South Korea, so large that its revenue has at times rivaled a meaningful slice of the entire national economy. When people picture Samsung, they picture glass and aluminium, clean rooms full of silicon wafers, engineers in white suits, a logo glowing blue in an airport terminal at 3 in the morning. They picture the future manufactured at scale, sold to everyone. That is the version you are supposed to see. A technology titan, born of engineering genius, destined for the semiconductor age. Here is the part nobody puts in the advertisements. When Samsung opened its doors, it did not sell a single thing that plugged into a wall. There were no screens, there were no chips, there was no glass. The company that would one day outmanufacture almost everyone on Earth began its life selling dried fish, local vegetables, and homemade noodles out of a modest storefront in a Korean market town. That is not a metaphor. That was the actual business. Groceries. So, how does a noodle and fish trading shop become the beating heart of the modern electronics industry? Not by accident and not by luck. The answer is a story about timing, about ruthlessness, about a country rebuilding itself from rubble, and about a founder who understood something most people never learn. That the product you sell today is almost never the product that makes you rich tomorrow. Let us go back to the beginning. The real beginning. The year is 1938. The place is Daegu, a city in the southeast of a Korea that does not, at that moment, govern itself. It is occupied territory, run from the outside, its economy bent toward the needs of an empire rather than its own people. Into this constrained, colonized, cash-poor world steps a man named Lee Byung-chul, the son of a landowning family. Educated, restless, and already on his second or third attempt at being his own boss. His earlier ventures had not gone the way he wanted. One involved a rice mill. That is worth remembering because it tells you what kind of businessman he was from the start. He was not a dreamer chasing a vision of gleaming technology. He was a trader. He dealt in the things people needed to eat. With a modest sum of capital, he founds a company. He calls it Samsung. The name is not an accident either. In Korean, it carries the meaning of 3 stars, and the idea behind it was something big, numerous, and powerful, something that would shine and never fall. It was an enormous name for a small grocery operation. A shop selling noodles does not need to invoke the heavens. But he chose it anyway, and if you want to understand this company, you should sit with that for a moment. From day one, the ambition was wildly out of proportion to the business. What did that business actually do? It traded. Lee bought dried fish, dried Korean vegetables, and fruit from the local region, and he sold them onward, moving goods across borders to buyers in the north and beyond. He set up his own noodle production. It was, in the language of the time, a general trading company, and in the language of today, a wholesale food distributor. Unglamorous. Essential. Profitable, if you were careful. And Lee was very, very careful. Think about what running a trading business in that place, at that time, actually demanded. There were no reliable banks handing out startup loans to grocers. There was no safety net. If a shipment of dried fish spoiled, that was money gone. If a buyer across the border defaulted, that was money gone. If the currency moved the wrong way between the day you bought and the day you sold, that was money gone. Every single day was an exercise in managing risk you could not insure against, in a market that could turn on you without warning. The founders who survived that environment were not romantics. They were survivors, hardened into a particular kind of discipline. They counted everything. They trusted numbers over feelings, and they learned in their bones that cash in hand beats a beautiful idea every single time. That instinct would shape every decision Samsung made for the next 80 years. Now, here is where the romantic version of a startup story would have you believe that the founder had a grand plan, a technological North Star, a dream of the semiconductor written on his wall. He did not. What he had was something more useful. He had a method. Buy low, sell reliably, reinvest relentlessly, and never ever fall in love with the product. The product was just the vehicle. The point was the accumulation. And then history did what history does. It broke everything. The middle of the 20th century was catastrophic for the Korean peninsula. Occupation ended, but what followed was division, instability, and then a war that flattened cities, displaced millions, and destroyed most of what little industrial base the country had. For a business owner, this was not a market downturn. It was an extinction event. Supply chains vanished. Currency became unstable. Entire inventories could be lost overnight to the movement of armies. Lee had to relocate, rebuild, and in some cases start again from almost nothing. Most companies do not survive something like that. Samsung did. And the reason it survived is the first real lesson in how this company actually works. Lee did not think of himself as being in the noodle business or the fish business or later the sugar business or any single business at all. He thought of himself as being in the business of finding whatever a shattered economy desperately needed and could not yet make for itself. Read that again. The product was never the point. The scarcity was the point. After the war, look at what a devastated country did not have. It did not have sugar. It did not have textiles for clothing. It did not have basic refined goods that a functioning economy takes for granted. These things had been imported, and now the money and the ships to import them were gone. So Lee moved. He built a sugar refinery, one of the first significant manufacturing operations of its kind in the post-war economy. Sugar sounds trivial to us now, a thing you buy without thinking. But in a country that had to import nearly every refined good it consumed, a domestic sugar refinery was close to printing money. There was guaranteed demand, no serious local competition, and a government that badly wanted the imports replaced. Lee had found a perfect scarcity, and he poured himself into filling it. He moved into wool and textiles, building a mill that would become one of the largest of its type. He was no longer just trading things other people made, he was making them. This is the pivot that everyone misses when they tell the Samsung story as a technology story. The company did not go from noodles to microchips, it went from trading to manufacturing, and it did so by reading a broken nation like a menu, picking off, one by one, every product that the country needed and could not supply itself. Sugar, wool, fertilizer, insurance, retail, media, construction. By the time most people in the West had ever heard the name, Samsung was not a company. It was a sprawling collection of companies, a conglomerate with fingers in almost every part of the domestic economy. And this is where we have to talk about how that was even allowed to happen, because it is the least understood part of the entire story, and it is the engine underneath everything. Samsung did not grow up in a free market. It grew up in partnership with a state that had decided, quite deliberately, to build national champions. In the decades after the war, the South Korean government pursued export-led industrialization with an aggression that is hard to overstate. It picked favored companies. It gave them cheap loans, protected them from foreign competition, handed them import licenses, and pointed them at industries the country wanted to dominate. In exchange, those companies were expected to deliver, to grow, to export, and to serve the national project. These favored conglomerates got a name of their own. They were the chaebol, family-controlled empires fused tightly to the machinery of the state. The word chaebol simply describes a particular structure, a cluster of many businesses spanning wildly different industries, all controlled by a single founding family through a web of cross-holdings. One family at the center, with its hands on electronics and insurance and construction and retail and shipbuilding all at once. To Western eyes raised on the idea of the focused, specialized company, this looks like chaos. Why would a phone maker also run a life insurance business and build apartment towers? But in a developing economy racing to industrialize, it made a brutal kind of sense. Profits from the boring, reliable businesses could be funneled into the risky, expensive new ones. The trading arm could finance the factories. The stable divisions could carry the gambles. It was an internal bank, an internal supply chain, and an internal safety net, all rolled into one family-controlled machine. And it meant that when Samsung decided to bet everything on an industry it knew nothing about, it did not have to convince outside investors. It could simply decide and move. Samsung became one of the most powerful of them. And you cannot understand a single later decision this company makes without understanding that fact. When Samsung eventually poured staggering sums into semiconductors, an industry where it had no experience and where the established players were decades ahead, it was not making a normal business bet that a normal business could afford to make. It was moving in concert with a national strategy with access to capital and patience that an ordinary company would never have. The willingness to lose money for years, to build for a future that had not arrived, to outweight competitors rather than out-innovate them. That is chaebol behavior, and it was baked into Samsung long before the first chip was ever fabricated. So let us talk about the leap into electronics, because on paper, it made no sense at all. By the late 1960s, Lee looked at the future and decided the company's next act would be electronics. In 1969, 3 decades after the first sacks of dried fish left that market stall, he founded a dedicated electronics arm, the company most of the world now thinks of as Samsung itself. Be precise about that split because almost everyone gets it wrong. The trading house was born in 1938. The electronics company, the one whose name now glows on screens across the planet, was founded in 19... One built the money and the method. The other spent it. Understand how absurd this looked at the time. This was a food, textiles, and sugar conglomerate from a country not exactly famous for advanced technology, announcing that it intended to compete in an industry dominated by long-established giants in Japan and the West. It was like a bakery announcing it was going to build jet engines. The expertise was not there. The reputation was not there. The market did not want it. But remember the method. Samsung did not need to invent anything. It needed to find something the market needed and could not yet get cheaply enough. And then it needed to make that thing at a scale and a price nobody could match. In the beginning, Samsung Electronics was not a fountain of original ideas. It was an assembly operation. It made components, partnered with foreign firms who had the technology, learned by building other people's designs, and slowly, deliberately, climbed up the ladder from cheap parts to finished products to, eventually, the underlying technology itself. It copied before it created. It followed before it led. And it was completely unsentimental about that. There is a word for this in business, and people say it as an insult. Fast follower. The fast follower does not spend the fortune inventing the category. It watches, it waits, it learns from the pioneer's expensive mistakes, and then it arrives with a cheaper, better-made version just as the market is ready to explode. In most industries, this is a decent strategy. In manufacturing at Samsung's scale, it is a weapon. Because the moment Samsung decides a market is real, it can bring more capital, more factory capacity, and more raw production muscle to bear than almost any pioneer can withstand. The pioneer proves the idea. Samsung takes the market. It is not glamorous, and it does not make for an inspiring founder myth, but it is astonishingly effective, and it has been the pattern again and again across decades. This is the real revenue mechanism, and it is worth saying plainly because it runs against everything the modern brand wants you to believe. Samsung did not win by being first. It almost never won by being first. It won by being second, or third, or fifth, and then crushing everyone through sheer manufacturing scale, vertical integration, and a tolerance for thin margins that would terrify a Western board of directors. Let someone else spend the money proving a market exists. Let someone else take the risk of the new idea. Then move in with more factories, more capital, lower prices, and more patience than anyone else can sustain and take the market by force. Vertical integration is the key phrase, and it is the thing that makes Samsung genuinely different. Over decades, Samsung built the ability to make almost everything inside its own products itself. The screens, the memory, the processors, the batteries. When you control your own supply chain from the raw components all the way up to the finished device on the shelf, you have advantages that a company assembling other people's parts can only dream of. You can move faster. You can cut costs at every stage. And in a strange twist, you can sell those same components to your direct competitors, so that even when a rival's phone beats yours, Samsung still earns money on the screen and the memory inside it. It is a position of extraordinary power. Samsung competes with its own customers, and its customers cannot afford to stop buying from it. Sit with how unusual that is. Imagine a car company that also made the best engines in the world and sold those engines to every rival car company, so that no matter which car you bought, that one company got paid. That is roughly Samsung's position in the world of screens and memory. Its rivals are also its biggest customers. Every time a competitor launches a flagship phone to great acclaim, there is a decent chance Samsung earned money on the display and the memory chips inside it before the first unit was ever sold. It is one of the most quietly dominant positions in all of modern industry, and most consumers have absolutely no idea it exists. They see two phone brands fighting in the shops. They do not see that one of those brands is a customer of the other, feeding it profit with every sale. That is the engine. Now let us talk about what it costs, because this model is not free, and the traps inside it have swallowed operators who did everything right. The first trap is capital intensity, and it is brutal. The industries Samsung chose to dominate, semiconductors and displays above all, are among the most capital hungry on the planet. A single advanced chip fabrication plant can cost billions upon billions to build, and it starts becoming obsolete almost the moment it opens. To stay in the game, you must keep spending colossal sums, forever, just to stand still. This is a business that eats cash. It punishes anyone who blinks, anyone who tries to coast on a good year, anyone who lacks the financial firepower to keep building through a downturn. Samsung can do this because of what it is, a conglomerate with deep reserves and a founding culture of relentless reinvestment. A normal company cannot, and that is exactly why so few can compete at this level. The second trap is the commodity cycle, and it is savage. Memory chips, one of Samsung's core products, are essentially a commodity. Their price swings wildly. When everyone is building factories, supply floods the market and prices collapse, sometimes below the cost of production. When demand surges, prices spike and everyone makes a fortune, which triggers a new wave of factory building, which floods the market again. Round and round it goes. To survive this cycle, you have to be willing to keep producing, and even keep investing, during the brutal down years when weaker rivals are bleeding out, so that you emerge on the other side with more capacity and fewer competitors. It is a war of attrition dressed up as a technology business, and Samsung fights it better than almost anyone. And here is the cruel mathematics of that war. The right move during a price collapse is almost always the counterintuitive one. When prices crater and rivals are slashing production to stop the bleeding, the strongest player does the opposite. It keeps its factories running flat out, it drives its own costs even lower through sheer volume, and it accepts painful losses in the short term specifically because those losses are even more painful for everyone else. The goal is not to make money this year. The goal is to make sure that when the cycle finally turns, some of your competitors simply are not there anymore. It is a strategy that only works if you have the balance sheet and the nerve to endure years of pain on purpose. Most companies do not. Samsung, built from the beginning to reinvest relentlessly and to think in decades rather than quarters, does. That is not a technology advantage. It is a temperament inherited from a founder who once traded dried fish and learned to survive anything. The third trap is concentration, and it is the quiet one. A company this large, this dominant, this entangled with a single nation's economy becomes a kind of hostage to its own success. Its fortunes rise and fall with a handful of product categories. Its governance has been repeatedly tested by the pressures that come with family control and immense political influence. When one company becomes this central to a country, the line between the company's interests and the nation's interests blurs, and that blurring cuts both ways. It grants extraordinary support in good times. It invites extraordinary scrutiny and extraordinary risk in bad ones. Before we close, look at what that method actually built, because the scale of it is genuinely hard to hold in your head. Start with the least visible part, the part almost nobody sees. Samsung does not only make its own chips. It runs a foundry, which means it manufactures chips designed by other companies, fabricating silicon to someone else's blueprint for a fee. Some of the most famous names in technology, companies that design brilliant processors but own no factories of their own, hand those designs to a small handful of firms on Earth capable of actually building them at the cutting edge. Samsung is one of that handful. It is, by revenue, one of the two largest chip makers in the world, trading the top spot back and forth year to year. The company that started by moving dried fish across a border now sits at the deepest, most invisible layer of the entire digital economy and takes a cut of devices that will never carry its name. Then there is the screen you are quite possibly reading this on. Samsung's display division makes some of the finest panels in existence, and here is the detail that captures the whole philosophy in a single fact. The most famous rival phone in the world, the one held up as Samsung's great competitor, has for years relied on Samsung to supply the advanced screens inside it. Think about that. Apple and Samsung fight in every shop and every advertisement, and yet Apple has been one of Samsung's biggest and most important customers, paying it billions to build the displays for the very iPhones meant to beat Samsung's own phones. The trader's logic, a century on, unchanged. It does not matter who wins the shelf. Samsung already got paid for the part inside. And when Samsung does decide to lead rather than follow, it can. In 2019, it brought the first mainstream foldable phone to market, a device with a flexible screen that bent in half years before most rivals had a serious answer. It was expensive, it was imperfect, and it planted a flag. After decades of being called a copier, Samsung used the one thing copying had bought it: total control of its own display technology to ship something nobody else could yet build. That is the fast follower turning, just once, into the pioneer, on the strength of everything the following had taught it. The reach does not stop at things with screens. Walk through an ordinary home and Samsung is in the kitchen and the utility room as much as the pocket. It builds refrigerators, washing machines, ovens, air conditioners, some of the best-selling home appliances on the planet. The same instinct that once asked what a broken country could not make for itself now asks what every household on Earth will always need, and answers it with the same relentless manufacturing muscle. Chips you cannot see, screens in your rival's phone, a foldable nobody else could build, and the fridge humming in your kitchen, all from one machine. Put numbers on it, and the scale becomes almost absurd. In its most recent full year, Samsung Electronics pulled in revenue on the order of 330 trillion Korean won, comfortably north of $200 billion, a record for the company, and it opened the following year with the single strongest quarter in its history, driven above all by surging demand for the advanced memory that artificial intelligence is desperate for. This is a firm that employs hundreds of thousands of people, spends among the very largest research budgets of any company on Earth, and by itself accounts for a staggering share of an entire nation's exports. The noodle stall in Daegu has become something closer to an economy than a company, and the family never let go. The man at the top today is Lee Jae-yong, known in the West as J.Y. Lee, the executive chairman of Samsung Electronics and the grandson of the founder who once counted baskets of dried fish. 3 generations, one bloodline, from a market stall under Japanese occupation to the chairman's office of one of the most powerful technology companies in existence. The day-to-day is run by a professional chief executive, Jun Young-hyun, a semiconductor man leading in a 2 CEO structure. But the family still sits at the center of the web, exactly as the chaebol model was always built to ensure. The founder is long gone. His method and his descendants are still very much in charge. So let us close with the 2 versions of this story, the one where the model works and the one where it does not, because both are real and both are instructive. In the version where it works, and this is largely the version that is played out, the founder's cold, unsentimental method proves to be one of the most powerful business philosophies of the 20th century, and never fall in love with the product. Find the scarcity. Integrate everything. Outbuild, outspend, and outweight the competition. Let others innovate, then dominate through scale. Applied with discipline across decades, and fused to the patient capital of a national industrial strategy, that method turns a small grocery trader into a global colossus that makes the screens, the memory, and the chips that the entire modern world runs on. The noodles were never the business. The method was the business, and the method won. In the version where it does not work, you see the shadow of every one of those same strengths. The capital intensity that builds an empire can bankrupt anyone who mistimes the cycle. The scale that crushes competitors leaves you dangerously exposed when a market you dominate suddenly shrinks. The vertical integration that gives you control makes you enormous, slow, and hard to turn when the ground shifts. And the deep fusion with the state that granted you cheap capital and protection can become a liability the moment the political winds change. The very things that make this model nearly unstoppable in the right conditions are the things that make it fragile in the wrong ones. Every strength is a debt that comes due eventually, That is the real story of Samsung. Not a technology company that was always destined for silicon, but a trading house that learned, in the ruins of a broken country, that the product is nothing and the method is everything. It sold dried fish because a broken economy needed dried fish. It sold sugar because a broken economy needed sugar. And it sells chips today for exactly the same reason it once sold noodles, because it found the thing the